In the summer of 1908, Sophie Jordan discovered something impossible in her grandmother's attic. She was searching for old quilts when her hand brushed against a leather portfolio tucked behind a steamer trunk. Inside was a single photograph, its edges soft with age. The image showed the backstage area of a theater. 4 performers stood among costume racks and props, their faces visible and clear. But scattered throughout the frame were theater masks. Comedy masks with wide grins, tragedy masks with downturned mouths. They hung on walls, rested on tables, and sat propped against trunks. Sophie counted them twice to be sure. There were 7 masks in total. She smiled at the old photograph and was about to put it back when something made her pause. Something felt wrong. She looked again at the 4 performers in the picture. Then she looked at the masks. Then back at the performers. Her hand began to shake. She counted the faces in the photograph one more time. There were not 4 faces. There were 11. The photograph came from the Carlisle Theater in Boston, a venue that operated from 1905 until it burned down in 1911. Sophie's grandmother had been a seamstress there, mending costumes and helping actors prepare for their performances. The theater specialized in dramatic productions, hosting traveling companies that performed everything from Shakespeare to contemporary melodramas. It was a modest venue, seating only 200 people, but it had a reputation for quality shows and dedicated performers. The photograph was taken during a production of a play called Voices in the Dark, written by a playwright named Vincent River. The play told the story of a family haunted by secrets from their past. It was not particularly successful. Reviews from the Boston Herald described it as unsettling but poorly structured. The show ran for only 2 weeks before the company moved on to another city. Sophie Jordan could not stop thinking about the photograph. She took it home and placed it on her kitchen table under a bright lamp. She examined every inch of the image with a magnifying glass. The 4 performers were easy to identify. They stood in a loose group near the center of the frame. A tall man in a dark suit, a woman in an elaborate gown, a younger man holding a script, a girl who could not have been older than 16. Their faces were clear. Their poses were natural. They looked like people waiting between scenes, comfortable in the familiar chaos of backstage life. But there were other faces, too. In the shadows behind a costume rack, there was a 5th face. It was pale and expressionless, neither smiling nor frowning, just watching. Near the back wall, partially obscured by hanging fabric, was a 6th face. This one seemed to be looking directly at the camera. By a stack of wooden crates on the left side of the frame, there was a 7th face, tilted at an odd angle. Sophie found more, a face emerging from the darkness beneath a table, another one reflected in a mirror that hung on the wall, even though no one stood in front of that mirror. 2 more faces visible through a doorway that led deeper into the theater, standing perfectly still in the blackness beyond. 11 faces total, 4 performers and 7 others. 7 faces that should not have been there. Sophie Jordan was not someone who believed in ghosts. She was a practical woman who worked as a librarian and spent her weekends gardening. But the photograph disturbed her in ways she could not explain. She decided to research the Carlisle Theater and the production of Voices in the Dark. She visited the Boston Public Library and requested old newspapers from 1908. She searched through archives and city records. What she found made the photograph even more troubling. The play Voices in the Dark had been plagued with problems from the beginning. The leading actress, a woman named Alice Arthur, had complained of feeling watched during rehearsals. She told other cast members that she heard whispers when she was alone backstage. The stage manager reported that props went missing and then reappeared in strange locations. Costumes were found torn and scattered across the dressing rooms. The director blamed the cast for being careless, but the incidents continued. Then came the accidents. During the first week of performances, a stage light fell during a scene change. It missed the actors by inches. The crew inspected the rigging and found that the bolts had been loosened. No one admitted to touching them. 3 days later, one of the actors tripped on a rope that had been stretched across a backstage corridor. He fell and broke his wrist. The rope had not been there an hour earlier. A young actress named Belle Landon began having nightmares. She told her roommate that she dreamed of faces watching her from the darkness. Faces without bodies. Faces that did not blink. She asked to leave the production, but the director convinced her to stay. The show was already struggling, and losing another performer would have forced them to close. Belle agreed to continue, but she started arriving at the theater as late as possible and leaving immediately after each performance. She refused to be backstage alone. Sophie Jordan found a brief mention of the photograph in a journal kept by the theater's stage manager. The entry was dated September 14, 1908. It read, "Photographer came today to document the production. Took several pictures backstage. When he developed them, he said one came out strange. Showed it to director. Director said to destroy it. Photographer refused. Said he wanted to study it. Director fired him. Photographer left angry." Don't know what happened to the picture. Sophie realized she was holding that photograph, the one the director had wanted destroyed. She kept searching for more information. She found a small article in the Boston Globe from September 20th, 1908. It reported that Belle Landon had been found unconscious in her dressing room. She had locked herself inside and would not respond when other cast members knocked on the door. They broke the lock and found her collapsed on the floor. Her eyes were open, but she did not speak. She did not move. A doctor examined her and said she appeared to be in a state of extreme shock. Belle Landon never recovered. She was admitted to a hospital and remained there for 6 months, unable or unwilling to communicate. When she finally began speaking again, she would only say one thing over and over. They were all wearing our faces. Vincent River, the playwright, disappeared 3 days after Belle Landon was found unconscious. He checked out of his boarding house and left no forwarding address. His landlord said he seemed frightened. He kept looking over his shoulder when he walked down the street. He told the landlord that he had made a mistake with the play, that he had written something he should not have written. The landlord did not understand what he meant. Vincent River was never seen again. No death certificate was ever filed. No records indicated where he went. He simply vanished. The production of Voices in the Dark closed immediately after his disappearance. The theater owner announced that the show was canceled due to creative differences. The cast was released from their contracts. Most of them left Boston within days. The Carlisle Theater continued operating, but actors who performed there afterward reported strange experiences. Cold spots in certain areas backstage, the feeling of being watched, doors that opened and closed on their own. Some refused to return. Sophie Jordan contacted a photographer who specialized in historical image analysis. She wanted to know if the extra faces in the photograph could be explained by double exposure or some other technical error. The photographer examined the image for 2 weeks. He used modern digital scanning equipment to study every detail. When he returned the photograph to Sophie, he looked shaken. He told her that the image showed no signs of manipulation or technical problems. The exposure was consistent throughout the frame. The focus was sharp. The lighting was natural. The extra faces were not the result of double exposure or reflected light. They were simply there in the photograph, captured by the camera in 1908. He pointed out something else. The 7 extra faces were not random strangers. He had compared them carefully to the 4 performers visible in the center of the frame. The 7 faces in the shadows were identical to 4 of the performers. The tall man in the dark suit appeared 3 times in the photograph. Once in his normal position with the other actors, and twice more in the background. The young actress appeared twice, once with her fellow performers, and once in the darkness near the back wall. Her expression was different in each appearance. In the center of the frame, she looked tired but calm. In the shadows, her face was blank and cold. Sophie Jordan felt sick when she heard this. She looked at the photograph again with this new understanding. The face beneath the table belonged to the younger man holding the script. The face in the mirror was the woman in the elaborate gown. The two faces visible through the distant doorway were the tall man and the young actress again. The same 4 performers appeared multiple times throughout the frame, but the 4 in the center looked alive. The 7 in the shadows looked like something else entirely. Sophie remembered Belle Landon's words. They were all wearing our faces. She began to understand what Belle had seen, what had driven her into silence and shock. Something had been backstage with the performers during that production, something that could take their appearance, something that stood in the shadows and watched. The more Sophie Jordan researched, the darker the story became. She found records of other theaters that had performed Voices in the Dark after the Carlisle Theater production closed. There had been 3 other productions in different cities between 1909 and 1910. All 3 reported similar problems: actors feeling watched, props moving on their own, strange accidents. In Philadelphia, an actor fell from a catwalk during a rehearsal. He survived but said he felt pushed. In Chicago, the leading actress quit after 1 week, claiming she saw her own reflection moving independently in a backstage mirror. In New York, the entire cast walked out after finding all of their costumes shredded overnight. The theater had been locked, and there was no sign of forced entry. After the New York incident, no theater would agree to produce the play. Vincent Rivers' other works were also avoided. Theater owners quietly blacklisted anything he had written. The few copies of Voices in the Dark that existed were destroyed or lost. Sophie searched for the script but could not find it. She did find fragments of reviews that described the play's content. It was about a family that discovered they were being impersonated by entities that lived in the spaces between light and shadow. The entities would watch people, learn their behaviors, and slowly take their places. The play ended with the family realizing that they could no longer tell which members were real and which were replacements. One reviewer called it disturbing and questioned why anyone would want to write such a story. Sophie Jordan wondered if Vincent River had written the play based on something he had experienced. If he had encountered these entities himself and tried to warn others through his work. She found one final piece of evidence in the archives. A letter written by Alice Arthur, the leading actress, to her sister in November 1908. The letter had been donated to a historical society years after Alice's death. In it, Alice described her experience during the production. She wrote that she had felt something wrong from the first rehearsal. She said the theater felt crowded even when only a few people were present. She described seeing movement in her peripheral vision but finding no one there when she turned to look. She mentioned that Belle Landon had confided in her before the collapse. Belle had told Alice that she had seen herself standing in the wings one night during a performance. She had been on stage delivering her lines when she glanced toward the side curtain and saw her own face looking back at her. The face had smiled. Belle had not. Alice's letter ended with a chilling statement. She wrote, "I do not know what they were, but they were learning us, studying how we moved and spoke, and I think they are still there, in that theater, waiting for the next production, waiting for new faces to wear." The Carlisle Theater burned down on March 3, 1911. The fire started backstage in the middle of the night when no one was in the building. Investigators could not determine the cause. Some speculated it was faulty wiring. Others thought it might have been arson, though no evidence supported this theory. The building was a total loss. Everything inside was destroyed. Costumes, props, scripts, and photographs all turned to ash. Sophie Jordan realized that her grandmother's photograph might be the only surviving image of the Carlisle Theater's backstage area. Certainly the only one from the production of Voices in the Dark. She thought about destroying it as the original director had wanted, but she decided to keep it as a record of what had happened, as proof that something unexplainable had existed in that theater. She made copies of the photograph and stored the original in a safe deposit box. She wrote down everything she had learned and created a detailed record of her research. Then she did something else. She visited every theater in Boston and spoke with the managers. She told them about the Carlisle Theater and the photograph. Some dismissed her as eccentric, others listened with growing unease. Several admitted that they had experienced similar phenomena in their own venues. Faces appearing in backstage photographs where no one had been standing. Performers reporting the feeling of being watched. Mirrors that showed reflections that did not quite match reality. One theater manager confided that they had stopped allowing photographs to be taken backstage. Too many pictures had shown unexplainable anomalies. Too many revealed things that should not have been there. Sophie Jordan began collecting stories from actors and theater workers. She found dozens of people who had experienced similar encounters. A costume designer who saw her own face looking at her from a darkened dressing room. A lighting technician who captured something on video during a rehearsal. A figure that mimicked the movements of an actor but stood several feet away in the shadows. A director who heard his own voice coming from an empty hallway, speaking lines he had not yet said. The stories followed similar patterns. The entities appeared in theaters during productions. They seemed drawn to places where people performed and pretended to be someone else. They watched from the darkness and learned. Sometimes they only observed. Sometimes they did more. Sophie documented everything carefully. She created an archive of unexplained theater phenomena spanning more than a century. The Carlisle Theater photograph remained the clearest evidence, the most undeniable proof that something existed in the spaces behind the stage, something that wore human faces but was not human. Years passed. Sophie Jordan grew older but never stopped researching. She gave lectures at universities about theater history and folklore. She never mentioned the photograph publicly, but she continued collecting stories privately. Other researchers began to notice patterns, too. Theaters built on certain types of land seemed more prone to these encounters. Venues that had experienced tragedies attracted more activity. Productions that dealt with themes of identity and deception seemed to trigger more incidents. A theory emerged among the small group of people who studied these phenomena. The entities existed in liminal spaces, the areas between one place and another. Backstage was perfect for them. It was neither the real world nor the fictional world of the stage. It was a place where people changed costumes and identities, where reality blurred. The entities thrived there, and they were especially active during performances, when the boundary between actor and character became thin. When someone pretended to be someone else, they created a kind of opening, a gap that something else could slip through. Sophie Jordan died in 1987 at the age of 79. She left her entire archive to a university library with instructions that it should be made available to researchers. The photograph of the Carlisle Theater backstage was included. Copies were made and distributed to several institutions. Researchers who studied the image confirmed what the photographer had told Sophie decades earlier. The extra faces were real. They had been captured by the camera. They existed in that space on September 14, 1908. Some researchers tried to explain them as elaborate hoaxes. They suggested that Vincent River had hired actors to stand in the shadows during the photograph as a publicity stunt for his play. But this theory had problems. Why would the theater director demand the photograph be destroyed if it was just a publicity stunt? Why would Belle Landon suffer a complete mental breakdown? Why would Vincent River disappear? And why would the photographer refuse to destroy the image, saying he wanted to study it? The hoax theory did not account for the genuine fear that surrounded the photograph. Other researchers took a different approach. They investigated whether the entities in the photograph could be explained by quantum physics or parallel dimensions. They theorized that theaters, with their focus on performance and transformation, might create conditions where different realities overlapped, where multiple versions of the same person could exist simultaneously in the same space. These theories were speculative and unprovable, but they offered a framework for understanding what the photographs showed. Something had been backstage with those four performers, something that could take their appearance, something that existed in the shadows and darkness. The photograph captured a moment when these entities were visible, when whatever barrier normally kept them hidden had briefly failed. The four performers in the center of the frame probably never knew the others were there. They posed for the photograph, smiled, and went on with their work. But the camera saw what they could not. It recorded the truth of that moment. 7 additional faces, 7 entities wearing the faces of the living, watching, learning, waiting. The photograph remains in the university archive today. Researchers continue to study it. New technologies allow for even more detailed analysis. Digital enhancement reveals subtle details that were not visible before. The 7 faces in the shadows have a slightly different quality than the 4 performers in the center. Their skin appears smoother, less textured. Their eyes do not reflect light the same way human eyes do. They look almost like masks themselves. Perfect copies of human faces, but lacking some essential quality that makes them truly alive. The photograph has inspired artists and writers. Several horror films have been based loosely on the story of the Carlisle Theater. But most people who encounter the image feel something beyond simple fear. They feel a sense of wrongness, a violation of natural law. The photograph shows something that should not exist, something that challenges our understanding of reality and identity. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What if we are not alone when we think we are? What if something watches us from spaces we cannot see? What if the face looking back at us from the mirror is not quite our own? Sophie Jordan spent 40 years trying to answer these questions. She never found complete answers, but she found enough evidence to convince her that the entities in the photograph were real, that they existed in theaters and other liminal spaces, that they watched performers and learned from them, that they sometimes tried to take their places. She found enough stories from enough credible witnesses to know that the Carlisle Theater photograph was not an isolated incident. It was simply the clearest documentation of a phenomenon that occurred regularly but was rarely captured on film. Most people who encountered these entities did not have proof. They only had their experiences, their fear, and the certainty that something had been there with them in the darkness. Something that wore a familiar face but felt completely wrong. The photograph asks us to reconsider what we think we know about the world. It suggests that reality is stranger and more frightening than we typically acknowledge, that there are things existing alongside us, in the spaces we do not look, in the shadows we ignore, in the darkness backstage where actors prepare to become someone else. The 4 performers in that photograph continued their lives after September 1908. Most of them never knew about the extra faces captured by the camera. They never knew that something had been standing behind them, wearing their features, studying them. Only Belle Landon saw the truth, and it destroyed her ability to function in the world. She spent the rest of her life in institutions, never fully recovering from what she had witnessed. She died in 1934, still occasionally repeating the same phrase, "They were all wearing our faces." Alice Arthur left the theater after the production closed. She married and raised a family and never performed on stage again. In her old age, she told her grandchildren that she had once been an actress, but she never spoke about the Carlisle Theater or Voices in the Dark. She took those memories to her grave. The photograph survives. It continues to trouble everyone who sees it, because once you notice the extra faces, you cannot unsee them. Once you understand what you are looking at, the image transforms from a simple backstage photograph into evidence of something impossible. 7 entities standing among the props and costumes. 7 things that looked human but were not. 7 watchers in the darkness learning how to wear the faces of the living. And the most disturbing part is not what the photograph shows. It is what the photograph implies. If these entities were there in 1908, are they still there now? Are they in theaters today, watching performances and studying actors? Are they in other places where people gather and transform themselves? The photograph cannot answer these questions. It can only show us one frozen moment when the camera captured something that should have remained hidden. One moment when the boundary between the visible and invisible failed. One moment when we could see what is usually concealed. The 7 faces in the shadows of the Carlisle Theater. The faces that should not have been there. The faces that were somehow both familiar and utterly wrong. They stare out from the photograph across more than a century, frozen in that moment of impossible visibility. And if you look closely enough, if you study the image long enough, you might start to wonder. Are they still watching? Are they still learning? Are they still waiting in the darkness for their chance to step into the light wearing a stolen face? The photograph does not provide comfort. It provides only questions and the undeniable evidence that something was there. Something that existed in the spaces between reality and performance. Something that might still be there today,